I'm Katie Barrett. I am honored to be a board member of Read Washington. And Read Washington welcomes you to this webinar with Dr. Tim Shanahan. We are really excited to have him with us today, and we're going to do some deep learning. Welcome, welcome. Okay, I'm going to get started here. I want to tell you a little bit about Read Washington. We are a nonprofit organization based here in Washington, and our goal is really to provide professional development opportunities based on the science of reading. And so working together, every student becomes a skilled and confident reader. We really want to prevent that unnecessary pain of reading failure. And together we can do that through opportunities like this. So again, welcome. Read Washington does have a global reach. We are on just about every continent. We have reached across the world in this really important work. You can see that the entire world shares this vision of helping students learn to read. These are our board members. So Julie Bedell is our president, Amy Fleischer, Frank Greif, myself, Ingrid Nyberg, and Dr. Jan Hasbrook. So many of us, Julie, Amy, Ingrid, and I are in classrooms working with students, working with teachers, and doing this work right alongside with you. So we are here to learn as well. A little bit of housekeeping that we have before we bring Dr. Shanahan on. We do have his presentation. We'll start at about 10:10 after we get through this little bit of introduction. We will have an opportunity for you to ask questions. What we do ask is that you put the questions not into the chat, but into the actual Q&A, and that's where we'll be able to see the questions that are beyond what's happening just in the chat. And then right around 11:55, we'll wrap up those questions and the talk, and we'll talk a little bit about some upcoming announcements that we have with Read Washington. You will get handouts and a certificate of attendance that will be linked in the chat at the end of our time together today. And everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording and the handouts, and that will take us within the next 5 days or so for that to happen. We really want to thank our sponsors. So our sponsors here in the state of Washington, the Reading Equity Project, Decoding Dyslexia, the Washington chapter of the Reading League, as well as the Washington branch of the International Dyslexia Association. We also want to give a big thank you to Oregon RTI, who also advertised this webinar outside of the state of Washington because, again, we have a global reach. So it's not just for our Washington educators that this work is so important. So I would like to introduce and talk a little bit about Dr. Tim Shanahan. So he is a distinguished professor emeritus from the University of Illinois at Chicago, as well as the founding director for the Center of Literacy there. He has been a director of reading in Chicago Public Schools, as well as a prolific author and editor. His newest book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, How Students' Reading Achievement Has Been Held Back and What We Can Do About It, is his latest book, and that he will be touching on that information today. He also has been involved in so many venues to support this work, including being an advisor to presidents, helping write the Common Core state standards, and being a practitioner himself as a former first grade teacher. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Tim Shanahan and his talk on the science of text levels, why reading has not improved and how we can change that. So Dr. Shanahan, it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Katie. Top of the morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to do a little futzing around here, switching screens and stuff. So just give me a second and we can actually start this show on the road with, I think that you should be seeing my slides. We are today going to, I won't be talking about the book, but I definitely will be talking about the ideas that the book addresses. The book has only been out now a little over a month, and I hope you get a chance to take a look at it. I think it's important to put talks like this in context. Many years ago, I figured out that I was thought of as a pretty good professional development person. Districts would bring me in to speak on professional development days and so on, and school districts liked me because I could often get teachers to do what I was talking about. I could convince them that something was a good idea, and that would make them feel like they'd made some progress. The problem with it, however, is I noticed that more often than not, even though I was sharing what I thought was really good stuff and stuff that was really closely based on the research and so on, uh, people might change and do the kinds of things I was talking about, but achievement wasn't rising. And to me, that's the only real measure of any of this stuff, if kids are actually doing any better. And so I started to figure out that if I came in and did a terrific job convincing people about how to teach vocabulary, there were a number of people in the audience who weren't hearing, this is what you do with the vocabulary part of your program. They were hearing, this is what we're supposed to do. And they would drop something to do it. And often what they'd drop would be something that I was assuming they would be doing. And so, you trade vocabulary for phonics or comprehension for vocabulary or whatever, and you're going to probably find that achievement doesn't go up. And so let me just again, I'm going to put this into context. Now, I assume that almost everybody on is going to be familiar with things like the simple view and Scarborough's rope and so on. Those kinds of models are not models of instruction. Those are models of reading. They get into the reading process and what the parts of that process are and so on. This model is really about teaching reading, and you can see it's got these concentric circles. And the one I want to really spend our time on today is talking about, for a few minutes, talking about the golden circle, the inner circle, the one that's closest to the children. I certainly one of the, my watch is talking to me. One of the things that I have come to understand in my years of doing this kind of work is that if you really want to raise achievement, there are three things you can actually change. When you see a school district that's successful in raising their reading achievement, it typically means they've changed one, two, or three of these things in some combination. One of them is the amount of instruction that we try to provide to kids, and more instruction generally is better than less instruction. I'm not going to get into amounts of instruction today very much, so that we're not going to be addressing that part of the model. But we are going to get into curriculum. That is what we teach. So it's how much we teach, the the curriculum, what we teach, and the quality of the instruction, how well we teach it. Uh, when it gets to essential components of reading, I would say there are four. Kids have to learn about words, decoding skills, spelling patterns, morphological structure, words and parts of words, all those kinds of things that where you can actually take a word out of text or you can take a word apart. Kids need to get development in that area. A second area of development is text reading fluency. Kids have to develop not just the ability to recognize words easily and well, but they have to be able to accurately recognize those words in text and be able to read that text as if it's language to put the pauses in the right place and so on and so forth, even when you're reading silently. A third component that instruction can address successfully is reading comprehension, teaching kids the kinds of things that you can do successfully while reading that can increase the chances of you understanding the text and remembering information from the text, being able to use information from the text. And the fourth one is writing. And of course, writing is important all by itself. And writing, in the case that I'm talking about today, writing makes a difference in kids reading. When you get kids involved in writing, it helps them to build really all three of these areas I just mentioned. Today, our focus is largely going to be on reading comprehension and a bit on text reading fluency. Word knowledge is very important. Nobody should reduce the amount of word instruction that we need to provide. Nobody should be teaching less writing as a result of what I'm talking about. But we really do need to rethink what we're doing with reading comprehension a lot and fluency a little bit. And so that's where we're gonna go. The third part of that inner circle is the quality of instruction. Quality of instruction is an issue of how much learning, how efficiently and powerfully somebody can get learning to happen. Example I often use is if you had two teachers who were given an equal task. Let's say we've got kids randomly assigned, so the group is equal and we've tested them. We know what they know and what they don't know. We've got two equal groups. We're going to give each of these teachers a half an hour to teach, so it's not going to be an amount of instruction difference. They're going to teach exactly the same stuff. Uh, for this example, let's say it's 10 vocabulary words. We want each of these teachers to teach these 10 words to their group, and they get a half an hour to accomplish it. At the end of the study, you find that one of the teachers was more successful than the other. In one group, maybe they learned 9 of the words and could retain them for a couple of weeks. In the other group, they learned 6 and maybe couldn't retain all of those a couple of weeks later. The only difference there, it wasn't the kids, it wasn't the curriculum, it wasn't the amount of instruction. It has to be the quality of the instruction. It has to be how the teacher delivered the instruction. And this distinction between what we're teaching and how we're teaching is a really important one that we're going to come back to. I would say that there are really two basic aspects to quality of instruction. One of those aspects of quality of instruction has to do with just general teaching quality. John Hattie, in his meta-analyses, says that the number one quality feature is that there be a clear instructional purpose that both the teacher and the student is aware of. Uh, when purposes are explicitly stated and people know what they are, more learning tends to happen. Another kind of quality feature it's not really about reading, it's about all kinds of teaching. It has to do with attention and distraction, minimizing disruption, making sure you have the attention of everybody. That's as important in social studies or math or health or any subject you might be teaching or any skill you might be teaching. There are also, however, a number of what I would call curriculum specific qualities. For example, when you're teaching phonemic awareness, it makes a difference if the children are able to see the teacher's mouth when she's presenting or he's presenting the words. Uh, a big part of our perception of language sound is really done visually by seeing what the mouth is doing. There is no other aspect of reading where it really matters if the kids can see the teacher's mouth. When you're teaching comprehension, the kids don't need to see your mouth. That's very specific to one aspect of learning. I would say that when it comes to fluency instruction and comprehension instruction, as you're going to see, one of the key quality features has to do with the difficulty level, the challenge level of the text, how much there is there in the text that the kids haven't already mastered and need to deal with. In fact, when I first started getting into this whole issue of text levels and stuff, I saw it really pretty much only an issue of quality of instruction. We were going to teach reading comprehension pretty much the way we would have. We're going to have the same overall amount of instruction and the same amount of instruction devoted to comprehension, all of that the same. And the only thing that was going to change is the levels of the books. What I've learned as I've thought deeply about this and studied the research and tried some things out with kids and so on, I've come to believe that, in fact, what I'm talking about today is going to be both about the quality of instruction. Yeah, we shift into a harder level of book than we would normally have used in the past. But that necessitates that we teach aspects of reading comprehension that we've always just sort of left to chance. And so, in some ways, it's beefing up that comprehension curriculum, as you will see. Um, a little bit more of centering. So right now we're talking comprehension and fluency. We're talking quality issues as well as content issues. I think we have two basic ways that we try to address comprehension, that we try to teach comprehension. One of those is through what we refer to as directed or guided reading. Um, what we're talking about there is some kind of communal reading of text. A group, a class, a group of people are going to read a text together with the direction or guidance or leadership of, in this case, a teacher. I don't think there's a single approach to teaching reading used any place in the world, as far as I can tell, that doesn't include some form of communal reading. Now, we also do these kinds of communal readings when we often when we do textbook study in science classes or social studies classes. So actually, what I'm going to be talking about today is specifically about teaching reading, but it also should carry over into what we do and what teachers need to know in those other classes where they work with text. So that's one aspect of reading comprehension instruction. Let me say one more thing about that. I know people, hear that term guided reading and they go, Fountas and Pinnell. Uh, Fountas and Pinnell didn't come up with that term. I mean, they've used it and made it a commercial item, and that's fine. In fact, it's, as far as I can tell, it's always been a commercial item. The term first started getting used in the 1920s by the Scott Forsman people. They were publishing their reading series, and they made some very important changes to those reading series in the 1920s. What they did that hadn't happened before in any kind of systematic way, anyway, instead of just publishing a collection of books that teachers could guide kids through, they came up with the idea of having a teacher's edition that would carry lesson plans. And so not only would you get a selection for the kids to read, you would get some guidance of what to do before they read it and what kinds of questions to ask and all that kind of thing. And they referred to this as their guided reading approach. And so it was a commercial term even then. And the term directed reading came a bit later, and that came up when other publishers were coming up with alternative programs or competitive programs with the Dick and Jane readers. And they had their lesson plans, of course, and those were directed reading lessons. So they were completely different, even though they had all the same content and steps. And so I don't care what terminology we use, but it is this reading together that takes place in pretty much every classroom, thank goodness. The other aspect of this kind of instruction is what I'll call targeted explicit instruction. These might be skill sheets. This might be a pull-out lesson. Maybe the teacher is going to teach kids and introduce various kinds of vocabulary to them and do a lesson on that. Maybe the teacher is going to give the kids a series of sentences or paragraphs to work on at their seat, and she wants them to connect all the pronouns to the noun or something like that, those kinds of things. Uh, and they have a place in instruction. That's not really where we're going to be talking today, but the notion of, gee, Tim showed us something really cool to do with this directed reading. Couldn't I follow that up with some more intensive practice that just focuses on that? And the answer to that is yes, of course you could. Okay, one more exclusion, and I can really jump into this. I know this is a little different than how most people present. Usually, when you're pushing ideas in a new book, the idea is tell people this is for everybody and it works with everything and they should do this all the time. And I'm cautioning you against those things, which is, oh well. Uh, uh, that's, I think if we really want to follow the research, that's what we have to do. There are reading changes as kids develop. Initially, decoding is an especially challenging or difficult task for many kids to master. And young kids need to foster those skills. When I'm talking about teaching with complex text, I am not talking about kindergarten or first grade reading much harder text. What the research would suggest there is some kind of a combination between decodable text and controlled vocabulary readers. You have words that are used over and over again that you want kids to master. Uh, as a former first grade teacher, I can tell you that most children believe that the hardest part about learning to read at that point is the words. And so, if we wanted to make text more complex for kindergartners and first graders, the way we would do that is by using less word repetition and using less decodability. We would make those word and spelling patterns harder for kids to recognize, which is not a good idea. That would slow kids down rather than moving them along. The research that we have on teaching with more complex text really is done from grades 2 through high school. And so I'm going to suggest that with kindergartners and first graders, we want to use, for the reading part, relatively easy texts that have a reasonably heavy focus on giving kids practice with the decoding and spelling skills and so on that they're being taught or should be taught in that word section of the curriculum. Now, that doesn't mean we can't expose kindergartners and first graders to complex text. I'm a big believer in reading text to kids at those age levels, texts that are well beyond what the kids could read on their own. I certainly did that as a first and third grade teacher. I did that as a parent, and these days I try to do it a bit as a grandparent. So I want the kids exposed to sophisticated content and language through read alouds, but for the kids reading, it's going to be relatively simple. By the time children can decode, I know they don't have all their decoding skills, but by the time they can decode like a typical end of year first grader, like an average first grader, or a beginning second grade reader, there is absolutely no reason to continue that diet of decodable text, except perhaps as a little bit part of a phonics lesson itself. But kids should be reading, as you'll see, more challenging texts. So with that, I want to jump into this notion of leveled reading, of kids working. Basically, what we mean by leveled reading is that the teacher is going to test the students, find out what their level is. They're going to match those kids up with certain books that are supposedly at the same level. They're going to group their classroom based on that and divide up the reading instruction time among those groups. And they will do basically, they might do a number of things, but certainly the central thing that's usually done in the comprehension piece will be some form of guided or directed reading. This idea came up in the 1940s. Well, actually, the idea was around much longer than that. If you go back and read what reading experts were writing in the 1890s and early 1900s and so on, uh, they were often saying that teachers needed to teach kids at their level. They never ever defined what that was. So, what it meant to teach kids at your level would be anybody's guess. But that changes in the 1940s. They come up with a theory that captures people's attention, and it actually becomes quite big in both in reading education and special education as that develops. Um, and so that's uh, this notion of teaching kids with books at their level is now used by the vast majority of elementary teachers, by the majority of middle school teachers, and according to teacher surveys, even about a third of high school English teachers say they try to accomplish it. And so this is a widely used approach. I'm going to suggest to you that the way comprehension is usually taught is kids are placed in those kinds of groups that I was talking where they're matched to books. And the teacher does some form of guided reading. Now, some of you might teach reading strategies, and there's a lot of research supporting that. But in fact, teaching reading strategies I would argue, is a form of directed reading. The teacher's going to show you how to respond to the text, and then she's going to guide you through various texts, and you're going to practice it, and so on. So even that is a form of guided reading. Reading comprehension, however, oh, one more thing that happens in our classrooms is kids are asked questions about the text. So you're going to read some amount of text, and I know teachers do this different ways. Some have them read parts of the text and they talk between the parts. Some have them read larger chunks, sometimes even the whole text, and then they talk about it. But the teacher guides those discussions, whether they're done throughout the text or at the very end. They guide those discussions with questions that are meant to give kids, to develop their reading comprehension skills, is the way we tend to refer to it. I know a lot of school districts contact me wanting help. They're writing questions that match up with their state standard skills. And so here's what I'm going to tell you is reading comprehension is not the ability to answer certain kinds of text questions. Reading is the ability to make sense of ideas expressed in text, the ability to negotiate the linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances of a text. What I'm talking about here, I know that's a long definition. The front part of it is pretty easy. The ability to make sense of the ideas expressed in text. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask kids questions. But it's the ability to negotiate linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances. Well, let's break that out a little bit. Every author is trying to communicate with an audience. He or she wants somebody to understand what they're writing. They don't always make that simple or straightforward, but they do try to provide some kind of affordances. A science text, for example, might provide definitions of the words. When they introduce a new concept, they put it in bold and they tell you what the meaning of that idea is. Or perhaps an example I like to use is the writer John Updike. I don't know if any of you've read any Updike novels or stories, but Updike had a very precise vocabulary. If he described something visual, you could see it. That's an affordance. That's something that the author's putting in there to try to help you to understand what the text is talking about. And there are others. The problem is that any affordance can become a barrier. And so that in that John Updike example that I gave, the author might use exactly the right word to describe what you're going to see, but if you don't know the meanings of those words, it just became a barrier to your understanding. You're not getting the meaning that the author was hoping you were going to get. And those barriers might be conceptual, they might have to do with the ideas themselves, they might be linguistic, they might have to do with the language, they might even have something to do with the page setup or the screen setup. How do you read these things? How are they supposed to make meaning? And so what we need to do is teach kids how to solve the problem of a text, how to get from where they are to actually understanding what the text says, which means taking advantage of the affordances. And when there are barriers, knowing what to do about them, knowing how to surmount them. What we've been doing is placing kids in text that they can already read up reasonably well. And we go out of our way to do that which means that there's very little for kids to learn. There are very few barriers to their understanding the text that we're going to use. And even when they come up, we're not in a position then to teach kids how to overcome those barriers. What happens in classrooms when a text turns out to be difficult for the kids, when it's too challenging, where they're not going to be able to comprehend it just from reading it on their own? And the most popular thing is to switch text, which is why in reading classes you test the kids to find their level so you can match them to the right book. So we replace the challenging text with texts that are supposedly at the kids' levels. And we're going to talk a lot about that one, so I don't really need to say any more about it right here. A second thing that often happens in classrooms, especially in the upper grades, is a teacher with a science book or a social studies book that she thinks the kids are going to have trouble with. A lot of teachers just do away with the book. They tell the kids what the text says. I have teachers telling me they can do PowerPoint every bit as well as I can, and they know what's on the test, and so they can tell the kids what they need to know, and the kids can read the text if they want to, but they don't need to. A third one, and this one's a bit more popular in the elementary grades, but it really happens even in the high school. Text is going to be hard for the kids, so the teacher reads it to the kids. Some teachers have a replacement for this. Instead of them reading it, they buy books through Audible, and they have the machine read it to them. And another kind of version of this is the teacher calls on the good readers and does a kind of a round robin or popcorn thing, and those kids read it to everybody. And the final one is the old-fashioned one of the teacher. I assign the books, I ask the questions. If the kids aren't getting it, it's their fault. It's not mine. I'm just the teacher here. I think it should be obvious to everybody in our audience today that if we avoid teaching kids to read challenging texts, if we tell kids what the text says so they don't need to read them, if we read the text to the kids so they don't need to read them, if we throw kids into challenging text and they can't read them and we don't do anything about it, none of those are going to advance kids. None of those are going to strengthen their reading. We need to think about this differently. So where does this instructional level idea, this notion of teaching kids with the right book levels come from? And one of the things I do in my book is I go through a history of this. I want to explain why teachers like you and me have bought into this idea, because I definitely bought into it. I thought this is what being a good teacher meant, that you got kids into these right groups and so on, just right books. Well, back in the 19th century, probably the biggest problem facing most teachers in the country was, how do you get kids into classrooms? How do you get kids into schools? It was, very few kids were going to school, and kids who were going to school weren't coming on a regular basis. And, it was very tough. And a number of things were done to try to make schooling more attractive. The textbooks in the early of in the 19th century, early 1800s, uh, some of the programs were a single book, some of them were two books or even three books, but they weren't really necessarily sequenced, or there wasn't any information about their sequencing. There was no guidance for the teachers. Teachers did use the textbooks, but they didn't necessarily follow a program. So, for example, Webster's Blueback Spellers were by far the most popular school book in the in the country. Eventually, over years and years, decades, they sell something like 100 million copies of it. Webster comes up with two follow-up books to it. But people will buy Webster's and then they'll go off and buy, a book from somebody else's program. There was no sense of levels. They started, one of the things Webster started doing was over time replacing the texts that were very much pitched at adults with texts that they thought the kids would be interested in. So, trying to change the content that the kids were reading about. They add illustrations to the book. They get the ability to have pictures. which is, kids will like that. Maybe that'll get them coming to school. Certainly, one of the biggest things that happens is in the 1840s, schools start being graded. They start sending 6-year-olds to first grade classrooms and 7-year-olds to second grade classrooms and so on. And what that leads to, of course, is publishers say, now we, instead of trying to sell one, two, or three books, we can sell six or seven. We need one for every level. And they make an effort to try to make sure that these books get gradually harder. Most people know about McGuffey's Readers. You've heard of those, which were the most popular of those reading series. But there was another one that was more aptly named. This was Tower's Gradual Readers. The idea being the books were going to get gradually harder from year to year, and it would make kids into a reader. And that certainly made it easier. Well, by the end of the 19th century, there were compulsory education laws in all the states. There were child labor was outlawed in all the states and nationally as well. And so by about 1885, 1890, uh, a lack of kids isn't a problem for a teacher. In fact, classrooms were routinely having 60 or 70 or 75 kids in them. And so the big problem for teachers at that point is how do we differentiate instruction? See, when you have 70 second graders and you recognize that some of these kids can read well and some of these kids are struggling, you recognize that just because they're the same age, they're not all the same level. That requires you to, gee, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to change? And there are surveys done in the 19 teens where teachers were saying that, like the majority of teachers said that they taught reading to groups of kids, that they gave these groups different levels of books. So uh, we don't know any details about this stuff, and nobody was writing about this. So we don't know exactly how they were doing that, how they were making those decisions, and so on. But from about 1915 to the mid 1940s, there were several plans published uh, aimed at helping teachers to differentiate instruction. Well, that's what they said they were doing. Uh, Actually, they weren't differentiating instruction. All of these methods were aimed at differentiating curriculum. How do we teach different things to these kids rather than how do we teach them differently? An idea that I think is really important, a distinction is really important. These plans, these schemes for getting kids appropriately differentiated are not just coming out of the universities, they're coming out of school districts. There's the Albany plan, there's the Berkeley plan, there's the Joplin plan. There are dozens of these things that get published where each district will sort of tell their story of how they've figured out to adjust levels and get kids to the right level and so on and so forth. And the scheme that catches on, the one that everybody pays attention to, is published in 1946 by a reading professor at Pennsylvania State University. And he comes up with the scheme that really everybody kind of buys into. And this is the one I think you all know, uh, independent level, instructional level, frustration level. Uh, we all have levels according to Betts. There are texts that people can read on their own and don't need any kind of instructional support. There are texts at the frustration level that are so hard people wouldn't be able to comprehend them even under the guidance of a good teacher. And an instructional level that if you match the kids to the books or the books to the kids in the right way, you will optimize learning. You will increase the amount of learning that takes place. And Betts came up with a scheme for how do you identify which books are at kids' instructional level and that kind of notion. And his scheme said you had to have the kids reading the text aloud. You'd have them try it, and you keep track of how many mistakes they made. And let's say it's a 100-word passage. He's saying if kids made no more than five mistakes and no less than two, so two, three, four, five mistakes with these books, that would be appropriate. And that the kids' comprehension should be basically 75 to 90%, 75 to 89%. So you ask them a bunch of questions. What he's going for are books that kids are going to be able to comprehend. Now, remember, the test is done, the informal reading inventories that he developed is done by the kids without any instructional support. And so the kids are just going to read this and you're going to see what they can do, what they can't do. But the idea is if you put them in books that easy, then they'll learn. If you put them in books harder than that, they won't. There have been various proposals made over the year about how to adjust this stuff. Edward Dickling, a special educator, he's, oh, no, no, no. Betts had it wrong. It's not 95 to 98% accuracy, it's 93 to 97% accuracy. Mari Clay with her reading recovery program. Now this was, remember, this is a teacher working one-on-one with a first grader, but she was shooting for 90% accuracy. She was saying the books could be even harder than Betts was saying. And Faunis and Pinnell have really kind of taken that criteria into those criterion into the classrooms in not just in first grade and not just in a struggling reader situation, but up through the elementary grades. Uh, there's something, these things all have the same theory. They've changed the numbers a little bit. There's some others, but they all change the numbers a little bit. And there's something else they have, and they claim that if you match the kids to the text in those ways, you're going to maximize learning. A second thing that they all share in common is none of them are research-based. None of them did they actually test it and show that kids learned more. The closest, Gickling did some studies where he'd show that certain kinds of things might change, but not learning. And the whole point of this is learning. So uh, all versions of instructional level theory share the same fundamental assumption. Appropriate text matching leads to accelerated learning. They all provide curriculum differentiation rather than instructional differentiation. And let me just talk about that for a moment. In most school districts, and probably in all of them, if you want to retain a student, if you want to flunk them, hold them back a grade, you usually have to start planning for that around Christmas time. Most districts will expect you to let parents know that you're thinking about that. They'll want some efforts made to give the kid a chance to catch up during the rest of that year. They're also going to take a hard look at not just at what that one teacher is doing with that one kid, but what's happening overall to make sure that there's not some kind of racial or ethnic or other kinds of bias in the decision making that's maybe unfair or maybe would call into question the decisions about retention. In other words, there's a lot of protections to make sure that kids are okay in that whole process and that it's minimized. But curriculum differentiation means that I'll take this third grader, I'm going to promote him. I'm just going to send him on to fourth grade. He's passed, but now the fourth grade teacher is going to teach him with the third grade curriculum or the second grade curriculum because when it comes to reading, the levels of those books tells you how complex the language will be, how rich the language will be, how deep the content will be. And so I'm going to essentially retain this youngster. It's like a ghost retention policy. I'm going to sneakily not let you know that I've retained the kid, but we've retained them. And we're going to make sure you don't know that because we're going to use all these crazy, oh, he's in a level J. Oh, okay, that's his level, and you're teaching him at his level. That sounds good. Thank you. That's the reason why, if you look at the national assessment, they say more than a third of American fourth graders are reading below basics. These are kids who cannot do their grade level schoolwork. Some of them quite low, but they can't do their grade level schoolwork. Surveys of parents indicate that 90% of parents believe that their youngster is on level or above level in reading. And so we are managing to hide the fact that we're retaining these kids, that some kids are going to get an opportunity to learn the grade level language and reading abilities. Other kids aren't even going to be given the opportunity. Big difference. Oh, and one thing you should know, at the time in that little history I did, uh, n nobody even talks about, well, what if we wanted to still teach everybody with the grade level text? How would we adjust instruction to make that possible? It never even comes up as an issue. And so it's these kids are never going to be given the chance. I want to very quickly go through a body of research here to want to take you through the research on this, and then I want to turn to what might instruction look like and what will we do with that, and we'll take some questions at that point and so on. Okay, I'm going to do this very quickly. The very first study on this that's relevant was done by a fellow named Kilgallen. This was a doctoral dissertation. In Bett's textbook, he claims that the instructional level is based on Kilgallen's research, and so we have evidence that this works. The problem is, I don't think you have evidence that it works at all from this study. I don't buy the study is fine. I just don't buy it as proof that teaching kids at the instructional level is a good idea. Bett's theory, remember, was that kids had to comprehend the text that they're being taught from. And the way to ensure that was to try them out in the text and make sure they could read it pretty much on their own with very little need for learning. What Kilgallen's study was aimed at was they tested kids, they tested 41 fourth graders, uh, and what they were looking for was how many oral reading errors the kids could make and still get that level of comprehension that they were shooting for. So they test the kids, they have various passages. They then look and can say, oh, look, this kid got 75 or 80 or 85% comprehension, and he, got made 5 mistakes. And oh, this one, he only made 4 mistakes, and so on and so forth. And that's where they came up with this 95%. Asked later where the 75 to 90% came up for the comprehension, and Betts couldn't remember, but he assumed it was just something they'd made up. And so this is the basis of what we've been doing for 70 years. Uh, I don't buy that I think what you really have to do is place kids based on this and put them up against kids who are, for example, maybe working with grade level text to see what the learning differences are. It's not what they did. It's the kind of evidence I would require. Other people believed that Betts was doing it correctly, but they thought he got the wrong numbers. William Powell would be an example of that. Powell was and he did several of these studies, but he tested kids first through eighth grade and a much larger sample of kids and so on. Same methodology, but he found two things. He found one, that there wasn't a single instructional level, that is, kids at different age levels could tolerate more or fewer mistakes in their oral reading and comprehend. Uh, and so he was actually finding kids were making 15, 20 mistakes per 100 words, and we're still able to comprehend at the 75 to 90% level. Powell's work was never accorded any respect. He was always treated as a kook because he had different numbers for the instructional level than what Kilgallen and Betts had said. Uh, Dunkeld, I think I'm the only person in the world who's ever cited this very interesting correlational study. Dunkeld takes a bunch of second graders and tests them at the beginning of the year with an informal reading inventory. He finds out how many mistakes, what percentage of accuracy and comprehension the kids get with the text that the teachers are going to use to teach. Remember, Dunkel isn't placing the kids in levels. The teachers are the ones who are matching the kids with books. And all he's doing is checking to see how well they can read those books. At the end of the year, he tests the kids again to find out how well they can read, how much they've improved, and then looks to see how hard the books were at the beginning for the kids who make the biggest gains. What he found, and as I say, never cited, what he found is that kids were making 15 and 20 errors per 100 words with the books that they were being taught with. And their initial comprehension wasn't 75 to 90%. It was down in like the 20s and 30s. In other words, clearly frustration level texts, but the kids working with those frustration level texts were the ones who were making the biggest learning gains. They made the greatest progress. Jorgensen, a very similar study with third, fourth, and fifth grade boys. It's not until the year 2000, a full 54 years after we start telling people to teach kids at the instructional level, that anybody actually tries it out experimentally to see if it helps. Uh, Morgan and her colleagues, they test these boys and girls with an informal reading inventory. They use Betts criteria, but so they know what levels the kids are at. They randomly assign these kids to one of three treatment groups. One treatment group is going to work with text at their instructional level. So if you read at a second grade level, you're going to be placed in a second grade book. The next group, those kids, whatever their level is, they're going to be placed in books 2 levels higher. And the third group, they're going to be placed 4 levels above their instructional level. So you know how this is supposed to come out. Kids in the instructional level books are going to learn the most. Kids 2 levels above might learn a little bit, but they're not going to learn as well as the first group. And that third group, those kids are going to burn the school down. They're going to be so frustrated. They're going to act out in your classroom. They're going to be a real problem. They do this for the school year. They test the kids at the end to see how much learning. You'll be pleased to know every group made some progress during the year. All the groups did some learning. The group that was placed in the appropriate level, in the instructional level materials, they made the least gains of anybody. They learned less, not more. That group that was placed 2 levels above their instructional level, they outperformed that first group by about 3/4 of a school year in terms of reading achievement. And that group that was 4 levels above, they didn't do as well as the middle group, but they certainly did better than the instructional level group. Brown replicates this study with third graders later on. And there are more studies, but again and again, what you see is that in these studies, teaching kids at their instructional level either adds nothing. The kids don't do any better. So why do all that uh, testing and sorting and grouping and so on? Or frankly, they do less well. They don't learn as well as the other kids. So we're doing a lot of unnecessary work that is actually quite often doing harm. Now, I wanted to take these two studies a little separately because these studies are not focused on regular classroom instruction like all those. And let me just go back on this. This Kuhn one was second and third grade. Homan's was sixth grade. Lupo's is ninth grade. Burns is a problematic study that I discount for various reasons. But these two are done with learning disabled kids. All these kids have a learning plan. Essentially, what O'Connor does these two studies. Ronaldo O'Connor, she's a special education researcher. The first study is kind of a mess. In fact, Marilyn Adams has really criticized me for even talking about this study. The reason that I do is because it's cited a lot. It's cited as evidence for the instructional level, and I think it makes it easy for people to say, well, Tim's not talking about low readers. This is only for the superstars, and that's not the case. O'Connor designs a really good study, but then messes it up in the implementation. She tests these boys and girls to find out their reading level, same kind of scheme that everyone else. She randomly assigns the kids to one of two treatment groups. The one of the groups is going to be in both groups they're going to get tutored, and they're going to get tutored in the pillars in phonemic awareness and phonics and vocabulary and fluency and comprehension. But one of the groups is going to deal with grade level text, and one of the groups is going to deal with instructional level text. And so these are all third, fourth, and fifth graders. The very best readers in the whole group are reading at like a beginning second grade level, and then everybody else is reading below that. And so think about it. If a kid's a third grader, might be reading at a beginning second grade level or less. Well, that's true for the fifth graders as well. So the way this would work, if let's say you're a fifth grader and you read at a second grade level, if you were randomly assigned to one group, you'd work in a second grade book. If you were randomly assigned to the other group, you'd work with a fifth grade book. She's this goes on, this instruction goes on, and what she does that messes it up is in the middle of the study, she decides that kids who don't look like they're making much progress in one group, she flip-flops them. She moves them to the other group. So now the comparison is kind of a mess, and you can't really tell. But let's just pretend like that didn't happen. She concludes that, in fact, the instructional level gives kids a benefit, but the only kids that she found received any benefit, she says, were in the bottom half of the distribution. Now, remember, the very top kids could read at a beginning second grade level. Everybody else is below that. And so we're talking about really beginning readers are the ones who benefited from being in instructional level text, which, if you think about it, what I talked about this earlier, those kids don't need complex text. They really need the practice with text that will contribute to their decoding abilities. So you see the problems with it. But this is cited a lot as proof that teaching kids at instructional level works. What isn't cited is O'Connor's follow-up study. She and her team come back later and they publish in the same journal. And what they publish, what she says in the study is there was something that bothered her about the first study. The implementation should have bothered her, but what bothered her about it, they'd audio taped the lessons, and so they knew what happened with with each kid being taught. And she believed, she says, that there might have been a systematic confound. That is, teachers in one of the groups were responding to kids' oral reading errors during reading differently than the other group. Think about it. When a kid makes a mistake, some teachers can have the kids sound out the words. Some might have them read to the end of the sentence. Some teachers might just tell them the words and so on. And so if one group was getting a somewhat different treatment than the other group, that might explain the learning difference. So she comes back, she does the same study. I don't have to explain all that. The one big difference, well, two big differences. This time she's not going to flip-flop kids, so we can get a clean picture of this. And two, she's going to train all the teachers that when kids make an oral reading error, they're all going to do the same thing. So that goes away as an issue. She does this. They test the kids to see which group does better. And what they found with learning disabled kids was, in fact, being taught in the instructional level gave the kids no learning benefit. They made just as big of reading gains working with books at their grade level as with the below grade level text. And remember, these are third, fourth, and fifth graders, and I've told you how well they could read and so on. No clear learning advantages from placing students at their instructional levels. When instruction was properly tailored to support more difficult texts, substantial learning advantages appeared, even for students with learning disabilities. Now, there's more research in the book and so on, but the fact is we've been using procedures that are definitely not part of the science of reading. I'd like to take a few minutes to explain why it fails. Uh, Instructional level theory depends on three critical mechanisms to be able to function, to be able to work. First of all, you have to accurately assess the students, right? You need tools like IRIs, informal reading inventories, running records, curriculum-based measures, those kinds of things. And they have to be able to provide relatively precise estimates of a student's reading level, right? If a youngster reads at a third grade level and the fifth grade teacher believes that the kid reads at a second grade level or a fourth grade level, they're clearly going to put them in the wrong books. And according to the theory, the kids won't learn if or won't learn very much if you do that. So you have to accurately, reliably, and precisely test the kids' reading. A second thing that has to be in place is the text has to be at the right level. You have to trust that the Lexiles or the Faunus and Pinnell levels or whatever are actually telling you, what you need to know about the text. The kids have to, again, if the texts are mislabeled, if we mismeasure them, kids are going to be placed at the wrong level. And again, that would undermine the chance of it working. And then the third thing is that the effective differentiation. Remember, the teacher's going to take these book matches and is going to say in their third grade classroom, gee, these are the kids who are going to work with the second grade book, and these are the kids who are going to work with the third grade book, and so on. And because they're working in different books, they're working with different curricula. I am not in a position to, just work with a group for a long time. I'm going to have to switch my teaching around. I'm going to have to divide instructional time up among the groups. And so, depending on how much time you accord to reading comprehension instruction in your classroom, let's say it's an hour a day, which would be really high, but let's say it's an hour a day, you'd be essentially trying to give each group 15 or 20 minutes of your time. So the group instruction has to be really powerful to overcome the reduction in the amount of learning that you're going to do. Well, when you look at the research on each of these issues, what you find is that reading tests are not anywhere near as precise as the theory would require. As Edward Gickling, that special education expert that I talked about earlier, he actually himself, even though he's a proponent of this idea of teaching kids at instructional level, points out that the standard errors of measurements of the reading tests are larger than the span that you're trying to place kids into. So let's think about this. I'll make this up. Let's say the standard error of measurement is 10 points. And what I mean by that is what we'd be saying is, Johnny didn't get a 90, he got a 90, something between 85 and 95, right? That's really the way tests should be thought of. And if you want to be even more accurate, then you're going to go out maybe another 10 and say, oh, I'm 95% sure that this kid is between 80 and 100. Well, how useful is that? You're trying to put kids 95 to 98%. You're trying to put kids 93 to 97%. You're always going to be saying he might be at this level. Typically, these reading tests are within about a year or two. And so if you say a kid is reading at a second grade level, that probably means he's reading at a first, second, or third grade level. If you're the third grade teacher, I would argue then you should be teaching him with the third grade text, not the second grade text. Um, Text leveling has the same problem. It used to be the way we would do readability measures is we would go in and take samples of text out of a book or an article, and we would test, we'd measure how hard those pieces were, and then we would average them together and make a guess about how hard the text was. These days, because of scanning and computer-driven stuff, the fact is when they say the uh, what do you call it? The levels of the Lexile levels of a given book are, it's 350. they've measured the whole book. And so they would make the argument that there's no standard error of measurement. You're not going to have this variance due to selecting passages. What they don't tell you is the way that they do those assessments. They don't really measure the whole book. They measure all the 125 word sections of it. And so they go through and they slice the book up into those pieces. They run Lexiles on each piece, and then they take the average of all of them. Typically, those texts range from about second grade through low college level. And so when you say a book is, oh, this is a fourth grade book, they're going to be third grade and fourth grade, second grade and first grade passages. They're going to be seventh grade, eighth grade, ninth grade passages. You're really not going to be having kids working mainly with the level that you claim is so important. And then finally, as I pointed out, the grouping means you're going to teach a lot less. No, kids are going to get a lot less instruction. And what the studies say is that, in fact, group instruction, when you pay attention to the amount of instruction, doesn't do any better than whole class teaching. And in fact, tends to have a very negative impact on minority kids. The original studies on that would say the minority kids were African American kids, so, contributing to our racial disparities. More recent studies say kids from single parent families are more likely to get stuck into these low groups, and therefore they tend to make much less gain than everybody else. Bett's original theory was if you got everybody at the right level, everybody would make really good gains, not recognizing that in fact what they were doing was penalizing the lowest readers and really holding them back. There's a relatively new study just came out last year where they looked at 28,000, not kids, schools, 28,000 schools in the United States whose student population on average are below level or below in grade level. And what they found out of those 28,000 schools, only about 1,300 of them, a little over 1,000 of them, actually managed to catch kids up to level. Everybody else, these kids are low and we keep them low. But these 1,300 schools in the country actually take these low achieving kids and increase their levels. What the only academic difference that they were able to find between these schools and the rest of the sample was that these schools in reading and math did not try to teach kids at their level, but they tried to teach with the grade level curriculum. They teach all or most kids with that, which should suggest why this is not a great idea. Why we fail, the testing lacks the precision needed to accurately determine students' levels. The readability measures vary too much across texts, within text, to ensure students are consistently reading materials that are appropriately challenging. The small group instruction reduces the amount of instruction quite a bit. The concept of instructional level is overly simplistic and mechanical. The approach views learning solely as the product of kids' interactions with text, neglecting the crucial role that teachers play in supporting and guiding those interactions. By placing kids in text they can already read, the teacher's role is diminished. The approach places severe limitations on what it is that students will be able to learn from a given text. Kids can already read a text, let's say with 95% accuracy. That would mean they'd only have 5 words to learn. Let's say kids read text with 75 to 90% comprehension. You're going to tell me that getting that kid to be able to answer that last question is really what we're going to teach. There's just too little learning opportunity. And so what we want to do is expand kids' learning opportunities and get them more ready for graduating high schools at levels that will allow them to fully benefit from our society. And with that, I want to jump into, okay, Mr. Smart Guy, you've convinced me, I hope, that teaching kids from grades 2 and up at their instructional level is not a wonderful idea. What do we do? How do you help kids to read these texts? What should our instruction look like? At least superficially, it probably won't look terribly different than most guided reading lessons. Kids are still going to be reading a book or a story or a chapter or whatever under the supervision of a teacher. There might be less small group work than in the past. In fact, I think that would be a good idea. That means kids will get more instruction, but it'll probably be more large group or whole class instruction. They'll still read the text in the various ways that you do, reading parts of it with, which is what I tended to do as a teacher, with the teacher asking questions. The questions are going to look a little differently, as you'll see, but I don't think an observer would even recognize that. I don't think the kids will recognize it. The biggest difference is going to be for many kids, the text would be harder. And so the amount of guidance that the teacher would have to provide, the amounts of involvement that teacher would have in the text would be higher. More scaffolding, the harder the learning demands. So let's take a look. I've got a list here of some of the things that make text hard and some other kinds of things that maybe we could do to help. And I'm going to use I'm going to use about a half an hour here, and then we'll open it up to questions and stuff. Um, but every one of these are things, just think of your own reading. You know, when you're reading something that you're not understanding or struggling with, what are the things that trip you up? And any of these could, yeah, there are others, I'm sure, but there's plenty here that requires teaching and support for the kids. So let's start at the biggest problems. You know, I said that we're not going to do this with kids that don't have those most basic foundational decoding skills. So we're talking about kids who can read like a good first grader at the end of the year, average first grader, or average second grader at the beginning of the year. So that's most kids. That's pretty cool. And it won't be that long before the others are able to do that. So most kids are going to be working with difficult text. But even kids who have already got those fundamental decoding skills. That doesn't mean they can read all the words right or that they can read a text fluently. And for a lot of older readers, and older here means 7, 8, 9 years old and up, uh, often they're having trouble reading words, they're having trouble with the fluency, and they are what teachers are afraid of and are what are drawing kids out. So let's talk about that a little bit. There's a kind of an interesting study that Matt Burns and some of his students and colleagues did. They tested boys and girls, and these tended to be kids with learning problems because he works with those kinds of kids. They tested the kids to find whether the books were too hard, and they made sure that they had kids placed in frustration level text below. He buys into that 93, 97%, so books harder than that. He doesn't pay attention to the comprehension part of it, which I think is a mistake, but there it is. But the fact is, I'm trying to give you a picture of how hard the text would be for the kids. So clearly frustration level text. And what their intervention was is they stepped in and before the kids started working with the text, they taught them words that they thought the kids didn't know. And I'm not talking about word meanings here. They taught the kids to read. Essentially, they tried to turn them into sight words, right? The kids are memorizing the words. And I know some of you don't like word memorization, but that's an important part of his scheme on teaching reading. And so essentially, what he found was by teaching kids some of those selected words ahead of time, they then retested the kids. And you know what they found? The kids were at the instructional level of the text, and therefore you could profitably go forward and teach it. But what, what I would suggest is that, well, in a way, that is what we're trying to do, right? The kids are going to have trouble reading this text. How can I make the text easier? I could teach them words that I think they'd have trouble decoding. And maybe I wouldn't go in and try to get the kids to memorize them. Maybe I would show them how to read these multiple syllable words. In fact, maybe that'll even be part of my word instruction today or yesterday, getting kids ready for this text to cut the distance between what they can do and what they can't do with the text. Now, that's fairly simple. Let me give, well, let me give you one more just example of this. Um, One of the things I learned in writing the book was that with uh, what people were finding, what researchers were finding is if you had kids read a text aloud and you measured how accurately they were reading it, keeping track of that. Let's say the youngster makes 10 oral reading mistakes. So he's at a frustration level and that, I took a 100-word passage. He got made 10 errors. It's too hard for him. I'm going to put him in something easier. What they did in some studies is they had the youngster read the text a second time with no instruction, with no information from the teacher. Just, okay, the kids read it. Now I want you to try it again. And they're going to just measure how accurately the kids do it. Generally, what they found was when kids read the text a second time, the number of miscues dropped by about 50%. In other words, we're holding kids back. We're keeping them from working with grade level text because on the first read, they weren't able to read at a certain level. But even without instruction, if we let them try it a second time, their scores would come up, and a large percentage of those kids would be reading at level, which really is a fluency issue, it seems to me. Students can benefit significantly from oral reading practice. Now, the way I see most fluency instruction, much fluency instruction take place in classrooms, tends to be it's tied to the reading group. It's going to be tied to the book that the kids are working with at their level. And what the teachers tend to do is they'll have the kids in the group. They do a guided reading lesson. Everyone's reading the story together and answering the teacher's questions and doing all that stuff. And when the teacher's satisfied that they've read the book or the story and they've understood it, the teacher might do something like, I want the kids to go back to their desks and I'm going to have, Jimmy and Sarah and Mary and Lou and, get together. And I want one of them to read a page from our story to the other kid and vice versa. They'll do some paired reading with it to practice their fluency and see, now I've taught fluency today. But they do it after the kids have read the text for comprehension. So what do we do with that? I'm going to suggest that you probably know which of your kids are going to struggle the most in terms of word reading and fluency reading with a given text. What if you arrange things so that those boys and girls actually get to practice reading this text aloud before you worry about teaching them comprehension and getting them to work with the ideas and other features of text? And so, for example, it might mean that this week, the fluency work for those kids is actually with the text that their group is going to read next week. Or maybe you can work it out with the intervention teacher that she'll, help you keep ahead of those kids. Or maybe mom and dad will help you with that, and so on. What that means is just by doing that fluency practice prior to taking it on for comprehension with the whole group, those boys and girls can be quite successful with it, much more successful with it than they would have. And I got to tell you, the kids really like that, being able to participate. Those low readers prefer being able to participate as more of an equal with their classmates, not because they're in a different, easier text, but because you've actually made it possible for them to do it. And of course, as kids learn each text, as they build up their vocabulary from each, as they build up their fluency from each, as they learn some of the other things, that is how their reading gets better. Um, Now, that's not, of course, the only way you can help kids build fluency. And so I have another example here. This is, I believe, a second grade text. Sunbeams are flickering over the landscape as the sun rises. A kit fox heads for her den, and you get it. It goes on like that. One of my favorite studies in reading is a study that was done many years ago with high school students. They they take a group of high school students and they randomly assign them to one of two conditions. They're both going to take a standardized reading comprehension test. One group is going to take the test just the way the test publisher designed it. And the second group is going to read exactly the same text and answer exactly the same questions with one difference. They parse the text for the kids. They, as you can see in my example here, all I've done is divided up the noun phrases, the verb phrases, prepositional phrases, and so on. Sunbeams are flickering over the landscape as the sun rises. A kit fox heads for her den as another day in the desert. You can see how what I'm really doing is supporting the youngster's fluency. The results of the study found that the kids who had the parsed text as opposed to the regular text were actually, they scored about a year higher on the standardized test than the group who had it just under normal conditions. If I have some kids who I think are being tripped up by their fluency, one possibility is to give them a version of exactly the same text everybody else gets, but the difference being that I'm going to give them that leg up on prosody, on grouping the words in a meaningful way. And over time, you'd like to uh, take that away. You'd like that to disappear slowly. Uh, so that the kids are trying to do that kind of thing themselves. But boy, I have this text that I think is a year above the kids' level. This kind of a support might be all you need to do to cut the distance between them. So let's say that we're dealing with some of those word things and those fluency things with the kids who need it. But another thing that can get in people's way is that they don't know what the author's talking about. They don't have the background knowledge. I know P. David Pearson's definition of comprehension I've always liked. It's a building bridges between the new and the known. In other words, good readers are, when they're comprehending, are connecting the ideas in the text with the ideas they already have in their head. Sometimes kids don't know very much about a particular topic that the author assumes that they're going to already know. And if you don't fill those gaps somehow, the youngster is at a real disadvantage. Now, let me give you just a real obvious example of this. Let's say your literature anthology is, your reading book is using excerpts, and it's got a chapter from Charlotte's Web, and it's chapter 5. And the kids are going to read this and you've got questions about it and so on. But there might be some information. In fact, it's hard to believe there wouldn't be information that E.B. White hadn't delivered in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 that might be necessary to fully understand and appreciate the information in chapter 5. In a case like that, the teacher telling the kids some background information about who Fern is and where she lives and who the different animals are, because it's not going to be foregrounded in the text, it's not going to be defined or explained in the text, makes great sense. What doesn't make great sense, but happens in many classrooms, is teachers will tell me the kids don't have the background to understand this. They're from a different culture, blah, blah, blah. And then what they proceed to do is tell the stuff that the text is going to tell them, that the text is going to present. That's not what we're talking about. In fact, that's a really bad idea. You shouldn't be telling kids what the text is going to say. You should be giving them information that they don't already have that would help them to make sense of the text, information the author isn't going to give. So that's one thing that can be done. A second thing that can be done with this is activating knowledge the reader already has. Uh, Studies show that if you can get kids or even adults thinking about the content, what is it, everything you know about salamanders, let's get that all written down, or let's put it on the board, or whatever. Getting kids to think in terms of what they already know can make that information more accessible when they're reading. The studies also show that that isn't just a pre-reading thing. Having different ways of getting the kids to connect the ideas to in the text. You know, you can go through a text pretty much paragraph by paragraph and saying, is that something I already knew? Is that new information? Uh, that Sarah Lupo study that I had listed earlier, that study done with ninth graders, that was the kind of things that she had her students doing that allowed them to handle the high school materials, even though their reading levels were much lower than that. So activating, getting that information to the foreground of what you already know about a text or adding information when that's necessary can be terrific scaffolds. Most classrooms, before they take on a text, the teacher makes some kind of background information building. In this case, the only thing that might be different is it's targeted more on identifying what you think the kids are going to get tripped up by, having a specific idea of what knowledge they might need, rather than just, oh, yeah, the people in here are going to take a vacation. Let's talk about vacations. So it's paying attention to what the text is. Uh, More and more what we're seeing, textbooks and teachers putting together text sets. Kids aren't reading a single text on an idea. They might be reading several texts on a theme or a topic or by a particular author, or of a particular genre. And so quite often in the past, the way that would be handled is, let's say it's topical. The teacher maybe has five texts on a particular about earthquakes, and some of the texts, it's hard to find five fourth grade texts on earthquakes. So some of the texts are going to be easier, some might be a bit harder. And what teachers would often do with that is say, well, little Jimmy here is one of my really low readers. I'm going to have him read the second grade piece on earthquakes. And little Mary here's a superstar. She can read anything. I'm going to have her read one of the fifth grade articles on, and then we'll jigsaw. They'll tell each other what they learned and they can share their information. I'm suggesting to you that you not do it that way, that instead of uh, distributing the readings in a jigsaw fashion, no, you want everybody to read it. It's just those really low readers, you might want to make sure that they're reading the easier to read ones before they take on the harder ones, so that they're actually, gee, the first one I learned a little bit about earthquakes. Now I've got a text that's harder language, but I already know some of this, so it's easier for me. And so you use these foundation texts to help essentially raise the youngster's level, at least with these texts. Okay, I still have about 12 minutes. Thank you very much. Everybody does vocabulary instruction, and I'm going to suggest we do it. Uh, Typically, it's tied to the guided reading lesson. Boys and girls, we're about to read this article about earthquakes. I have some words that the author's going to use, and I want to make sure you know what they are. Here's magma. Magma is that, pump, 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 and the teacher defines it, and the kids maybe tell that they saw it on television or whatever. Terrific. Why do we do that? Well, we've got two reasons. One, we want youngsters to accumulate larger and larger vocabularies. Everybody's on board with that. And the more important, the more valuable the words are, the more they get used, the better. We also were doing it just before they read a text that's going to use these words because we hope that it'll give the kids a leg up on the text. We hope it will enable their text understanding. And in fact, there are studies that show that it does increase their comprehension of the text. So those are our two reasons. You wouldn't necessarily see any kind of difference in instruction, but you might see a difference with what I'm talking about in which words are focused on. Because it seems to me if our purpose right now is to enable kids to understand this text, we probably should be selecting words differently. Instead of picking what the most important words are, not in terms of this text, but in terms of the language, we are probably putting kids in texts that they're going to struggle with and aren't going to know what to do with. Now, don't misunderstand me. Those important words, those words that you read, those tier two words that you want everybody to know, I'm not saying you shouldn't spend time on them, but if the purpose right now is to get kids ready for this text, we need to be focused not on the most important words to generally know, the most important ones to know right now. So here are some concerns. This is, I believe, a fourth grade text. And you can see what it says. This is just typical science text for fourth graders. And the question becomes, which words, if any, would you pre-teach? Now, if we were all together, I'd have you make some guesses. Since we're not, I will tell you what the publisher did. And I'm not picking on this publisher because everybody does this. Teachers do this. They pick photosynthesis from this passage. I don't know if you had enough chance to read it, but the purpose of this paragraph is to explain what photosynthesis is. In other words, it's defining the word. If you pre-teach the word photosynthesis, there is absolutely no reading comprehension to be done here. You don't need to. Teacher says, "Hey, photosynthesis is how plants eat." I can blow this off, and at the end, when the teacher says, "So what is photosynthesis?" I'm going to say it's how plants eat, and she's going to say, "Terrific, you got it." But I didn't get it. There's a study that came out last year of college students, and it says something like 92% of them cannot recognize in a science book when they're giving a science definition. And I suspect it's because in second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way up through 12th grade, we never allow kids to read science definitions. I would claim that's the affordance here. The author is going to use this concept, and therefore he's going to explicitly define it and explain it to you. And so the reading comprehension task here is I have to figure out what photosynthesis is and be able to talk about it or write about it. I wouldn't, anytime a word is going to be defined by the author, I would turn that into a comprehension question, not a word to be pre-taught. And then there's this passage, and I took this out of a fifth grade book, I believe. And these aren't the publisher's highlights, these are mine. And let me just do one of them. I'm going to pick glaciers. Now remember, this is for fifth graders. Some scientists argue that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted and so on. Okay, so glaciers is the word. And you can see glaciers is not defined, or glaciers. Some kid might try to read it, glaciers. Okay, so they don't know what a glacier is. Now, some will, but they don't know what a glacier is. And the author's not going to tell them. The author's just using this as an example or as evidence that global warming is happening. But I think a 10-year-old youngster, a 9-year-old youngster is going to be able to figure out what a glacier is, even if they don't know it, if they read that second sentence. I believe they will. You might make a different judgment as a teacher and want to pre-teach it, and that's acceptable. But my guess is that there's information there. I mean, first of all, glaciers are going to melt. What melts? What do you think their glaciers are made of? And they're so big, apparently, that when they melt, sea levels rise. That tells me something about them. I think kids could figure this out. I don't want to pre-teach words that youngsters can read in context. I think every reading program I've ever seen at every grade level has like two sheets, worksheets on trying to figure out word meanings from context. And I'm suggesting that every guided reading lesson, teachers should highlight some of these words that the authors aren't going to define, that they think the kids could figure out, and that should become a regular lesson. If kids couldn't tell me what a glacier was, I would take them back and we'd reread this sentence. Initially, I'd show them what I do with it. Over time, I'd guide them to do it, and then I'd expect them to do it. There is more to comprehending a text than just words and just decoding and fluency and stuff. There ton of research now showing the importance of sentence comprehension and how that contributes to overall comprehension. A lot of our boys and girls don't make sense of the syntactic complexity of sentences. Here's an example I took out of a fifth grade book. Now, remember, this is part of an overall article about something, but there's this one sentence. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. It's 25 words long. It's got 5 commas. Those 25 words are going to put a load on kids' memories, and those 5 commas tell you that there are connections that need to be made here. That's a lot of work that goes into it. A lot of kids are going to read the words in this sentence and have no idea what they're reading. Oh, I want to ask you to think about this or look at this. Can you find any verbs in this sentence? I hope you found one. In fact, it's the 23rd word in the sentence. Linguists tell us that, well, they tell us a couple of things. One, they tell us that when we're trying to interpret oral language, that usually in English, the verb is going to be the second or third word in the utterance. It's going to come fairly early. And that's important because when people try to interpret utterances or sentences, they do it from the verb out. You figure out what that verb is, and then you didn't know you're doing that in your head, but you're looking for that verb, and then you try to connect all the ideas to it. German can be particularly hard for people to learn because they have some constructions where verbs are the last word in the sentence. And so, you have to hold everything in memory before you can start operating on it. Well, I said linguists have taught us a couple things. Another thing that they've been teaching us recently is over the last 50 years or so, verbs are migrating later and later in English sentences. And in fact, it's science text that's driving that movement, but it's coming up now in novels and newspapers and so on. Uh, that's a tough construction for kids to make sense of. They have to read a lot of words before they find the verb, and that's very, very important. So, what would I do with this? And what I would do with this is I told you questions might be a little different going forward. Instead of having kids practicing answering main idea questions or supportive detail questions or drawing conclusions questions or inference questions, I'm going to ask kids questions that help me to understand if the kid's comprehension is being disrupted by something. And so I think this sentence is going to throw kids. I don't think they're going to get the ideas. And so I'm going to ask them a crazy question like, what did the IAU do? Now, I'm not going to highlight this sentence. I'm going to ask it just along with any other questions that I would normally ask. If the kids can't tell me what the IAU did, I was right. I know they couldn't understand the sentence. If they can answer my question, then I can move on. If I do have to show them, gee, the kids couldn't get it, I'm going to take them back to the sentence. Again, initially, I'll show them what I would do. I would break this sentence down. And so I've got this one broken down. However, on August 24th, 2006, and look at all of this blue is the subject. It's the noun. So, however, on August 24th, 2006, the IAU made an announcement. All of a sudden, this sentence just got a lot easier. You can see that made is kind of hidden away there. Some people don't like this. They tell me it's too much like sentence diagramming. So another possibility is I take them back to that sentence and I'm going to have them read and reread the sentence to answer my questions. Who was it about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When? And so on. As the kid has to break down that sentence himself to answer each of those questions, that can carry forward. I want to show you one more. I've got a great example here of another really complicated sentence. Let me just at least show you the question so that I want you to get that concept. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. 44 words, two commas, and an M dash. I'm going to guess kids are going to have trouble with the sentence. I might ask them what the women of Montgomery did, right? Again, if they can answer it, we move on. If they can't, I can take them through and show them how to make sense of it. And I've got some suggestions here for identifying challenging sentence patterns. But I want to show you one more example, and I promise I'll shut up. Supporting text cohesion. Um, Texts become challenging when the relationships and connections among ideas between ideas are unclear to readers, when they're too subtle, when they're too far apart, when they're ambiguous. This I took right out of a study. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Uh, the study shows that the first sentence is harder than the second sentence. The reason when we connect ideas in text with nouns, we do it either with synonyms, we do it with repetition, we do it with pronouns. In this case, the repetition is easier to understand for some kids anyway, than the synonym that's there. So let me show you this example. This is a fifth grade passage. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. I can imagine a teacher assigning that page to the kids to read silently. And then when it's done, she says, "What's the scientific process that's being explained there?" And a lot of kids are not going to be able to answer that question, right? They're going to be lost. So, what would I do with that? And I would have kids probably working in teams on doing this initially, at least. I would ask them to identify that first concept, first scientific concept in here, and then to go and find all the mentions of it. And so in this case, the first one is nebula. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until the nebula formed a large flat ring around the nebula. Okay. And then I want them to find the second concept, the sun. So the nebula orbits around the sun, and it's hottest where it's closest to the sun, and the disk swirls around the sun. And then the third one is that ring. The nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring around the nebula. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where the disk or ring was closest to the sun and coolest at the disk or ring's outer edge. As the disk or ring swirled around the sun, we get another one. Now it's the sun's gravity. The sun's gravity goes to work. The sun's gravity pulled. Look at this. They used it for 3 or 4 different concepts in 3 or 4 different sentences. That's why this is such a hard passage for kids. And if you have them going through this, what you're going to find is they can figure it out. You can show them how to figure it out. And so my favorite part is the red part here. I could see this on a whiteboard. Bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas equals they equals clumps of material equals planets. This is how planets get formed. Now I get what I'm reading about. I wouldn't tell the kids that ahead of time. I want them to read that and figure it out. They might not know what a nebula is, but in fact, in this text, it's explained a little bit earlier, and so they shouldn't need that. Um, and I've got, again, several examples here of different ones that might be hard and guidance for what to do, how to notice whether cohesion is an issue or a problem. It's not always the nouns, sometimes it's cause and effect or sequences and so on. Uh, Text structure matters as well. Strategies matter. Repetition matters. It's a lot of stuff, guys. The point is, we're teaching kids with texts that are too low to initiate much learning. We need to place kids in texts that I would argue for grade level texts, since those, if kids can accomplish those as they move through school, will allow them to graduate from high school with reading levels sufficient to their needs. When we keep dropping kids back, we are losing them. We are holding them back instead of moving them forward. But of course, to make that all work, we have to teach kids how to read those texts. And that's what that last part was all about. I will stop. Katie, Julie.
We do have some questions in the Q&A that we would love for you to answer if you could. One is from Teresa. I understand and agree with the concerns on using independent instructional frustration levels to teach children. How does one know what a grade level actually is?
You know, historically, it was just up to the publishers, and publishers, some had harder text and some had easier text. That all kind of changed in 2010 when the Common Core standards, did some studies they went looking to see what level of reading kids would have to leave high school with to be able to enter the military, to be able to do the work that a freshman in college does, say, in an English class, and what young workers need to do in the kinds of jobs that hire 18 and 19 and 20-year-old young workers. And they set that level and then they backed it down using Lexiles and 4 or 5 other of these readability schemes. I think though, and many states have drifted away or made changes to their standards, but in fact, most states have kept those levels. And so I would say those are the grade levels. Though, and they're each set as ranges because remember, these numbers aren't real precise and they overlap a bit from grade level to grade level. But I think those should be your targets. Even if your state isn't using those, I still think they give you a good set of numbers to be able to say, this is really a 5th grade text or this is really a 3rd grade text. And I think that it should be the targets.
Okay, so Amanda asks, how does all of this affect Tier 2 instruction? Is small group instruction appropriate there? And it sounds like we should be using challenging text in Tier 2 as well in grades 2 and above, correct?
Yeah, let's think about this. If you buy my notion that the harder the text is for the kids, the more support they should get, right? The teacher should be helping. We do kind of the opposite of that. If a kid is let's say this is a low reader, he's more likely to be taught from grade level text in the classroom than he is when he's working in the small group with a teacher who's really skilled in this and trained in this and is working with them. I would argue that not only should the classroom teacher be making sure that the kids are, when they're doing their comprehension work, are working at level, but boy, that intervention teacher is able to do that even more powerfully because she can really see what the kids are getting and has fewer kids and so on and so forth. We do kind of the opposite. The harder the situation, the harder the text we put kids in. And so I'd like to see us flip that over. That boy, when the more supported the situation is, boy, I have a highly trained teacher here. She only has a few kids to work with. She's only going to be working with reading with them. I want those teachers to especially be demanding because they can give more support than the kids could get elsewhere. So we need to flip it.
Great. Okay, so Ada asks, would it benefit teachers to understand the Lexile level range for each student and then jump to Lexile levels to promote text complexity?
You know, I said that the tests, and including tests that are aimed at, getting kids Lexiles, uh, are not going to be precise. But the fact is, tests can give you a range of difficulty, and you can match that up with the range of difficulty of the text you're going to be teaching from in your class. not to match the kids, not to, oh, I'll assign this book to the kid because of that, but to tell the teacher how much support might a youngster need. The greater the distance between the kid and the text, the more need you might have for the kids to, be given support. And so if I'm the teacher, it's terrific for me to know these six kids are going to be in big trouble. Maybe I want to sit them closer to me. Maybe they're the kids I'm going to talk to the intervention teacher about helping me keep ahead of them. Maybe moms and dads will help me. I'd be, so I think what that question is suggesting is really smart. Yeah, you want to see what the difference is, not so that you can hold kids back, but so you know how much support, how much rereading they might need, that kind of thing. It's just a general guidance.
Anonymous asks, is the practice of echo reading helpful, recommended, or effective?
Studies of echo reading say that it can be an effective way of building fluency. And so, in these situations where fluency is the support you want to give to kids to give them a leg up, yeah, echo reading can work. I prefer things like paired reading more, but in fact, things like echo reading do work.
We have a question about K1 writing. Do you advise both developmental spelling and or so here's let me reread this. I'm trying to synthesize instead. I'll just read it.
Hard work.
What does Dr. Shanahan advise regarding writing in K1? Uh, there's a program name here that I'm not reading correctly. Kid writing both employ developmental spelling, while speech to print advocates advise using only decodable words and sentences using sounds kids have been taught through dictation. I appreciate and value both, but have limited instructional time. What gives the most bang for the buck?
I want, in the word part of the kids' instruction, I want them taught decoding. I want them taught spelling. I want them taught, given, opportunities to read decodables and so on. On writing, I want kids to build their phonemic awareness skills by actually, yeah, things like developmental spelling make sense. Why would you do both? Teaching kids those kinds of things directly and then allowing them to write? Because I want kids to be able to write words that they're trying to write. The notion of limiting kids' writing to a handful of words is, I think, silly. Having taught first grade, I can tell you that kids, two things. One, it allows them to write much more and much more complex text. And two, it does not stunt them. They do not get locked into it. Their spellings are constantly changing. The developmental studies show us. Kids are not that locked into spellings, and the reading that we have them do and the decoding work we teach them and the spelling work we teach them will be the corrective you need. Certainly don't tell kids that they're spelling correctly. They're spelling in the way they can right now, and as they learn more and more words and more word patterns, you'll see that their spelling changes, improves, becomes more standard.
Okay, and I think we have time for maybe one more here. So Anonymous says, building text reading fluency from what I have seen at the middle school, many teachers read aloud with the student, rarely reading and struggling with text on their own. Can you clarify the balance of guided reading and reading aloud? I am concerned that we are making students adult dependent. Thank you.
Yeah, well, if you remember, I said that there were four big things that kids needed to learn. Certainly, one of them is fluency, and the most powerful way of teaching that, I gave some other ways, but the most powerful way of teaching that is oral reading practice. But it's not the kind of oral reading practice that you're probably seeing in the middle school. It's not the round robin kind of thing of, Julie, would you read a paragraph to every, Katie, it's your turn to, it's not that kind of thing. It's more that echo reading question earlier and so on. When it comes to comprehension instruction, even as early as high first grade, I think we should be trying to get kids to do that reading silently. Uh, they don't do it as well as they do oral reading, but of course we're trying to that's the point. We're trying to teach them how to do this stuff. So what I'd really like to see when you're doing guided reading and taking kids through a text for the purpose of comprehension, that the reading mainly be silent. first grade, it has to be oral, but certainly by second grade, it should be silent. But that doesn't mean there isn't still oral reading going on in there to build the kids' fluency. So I would, those two time periods, those two different parts of the lesson, different things are going on for different reasons, different purposes.
Perfect. Dr. Shanahan, thank you so much for your time today. This has been very informative, and I know that our audience here has been very appreciative of your sharing and guidance with us. Um, I want to remind everybody, Amy just put into the chat the link for Dr. Shanahan's new book. So if you want to dig deeper, for sure, check out that new book. Also, the link for the information from this webinar is also in the chat right now. So both of those links are there. I also want to invite everybody to save the date. So we have an event coming up with Dr. Freddie Hebert from the Text Project on the science of text reading and vocabulary, which I think pairs very well with what Dr. Shanahan just shared with us. So that's Saturday, March 21st from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And that link will go out in all of our emails the same way that you found the link for this webinar. So again, thank you all so very much. We really appreciate your attendance at our webinar, and we will see you at our next event. And what we know is together we can prevent the unnecessary pain of reading failure. Again, Dr. Shanahan, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, everybody.